apparently the working blue actually comes from this one guy in vaudeville who he would go out on stage and he had a blue book of jokes and a white book of jokes. And he would ask the audience which one. And the blue book was the offensive one.
Sure, sure.
And so that just caught on and it became working blue.
That's great.
Yeah, I thought that was a really neat little factoid that we dug up.
People, despite our best efforts, are going to learn something by listening to us. It's a
Every once in a
shameful
while,
thing.
I'm sorry, folks. It's just going to happen.
Shameful thing.
We're gonna put things in your brain meats.
The brain meat's right.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Naked Diner. I'm Jack. With me, as always, is
Andy Hall.
And this week we have author of Secular Meditation, Rick Heller.
Rick Heller's a great guy. I've known him for a number of years. Let's look at what his book jacket says about him. Meditation teacher Rick Heller leads the Humanist Mindfulness Group at the Humanist Community at Harvard. A freelance journalist, he has written for the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Buddha Dharma, which I think I just kind of butchered that word, Free Inquiry, Tikkun, pretty much I butchered that word too, and Wise Brain Bulletin. Bum, bum, bum. That's our guest. He's a good guy.
Yeah, his book, I'll be honest, I didn't completely finish it.
Dude, I have like 2 pages worth of notes.
I read a bunch of, the thing is, I've done meditation stuff before.
Right.
So a lot of it was very reviewy for me.
Sure, I understand that, yeah.
So, I skipped around a bit. That's what it comes down to. The personal story stuff, I was just like,
I found some of the personal story, not surprisingly, I found some of the personal story stuff interesting, which I will bring up when we're talking with Rick.
See, that's just me and part of my brain where I want,
you want data?
Meditation guides, yoga guides. I want them written like engineering manuals. I don't want to.
Well, that Rick was an engineer at one time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those parts, where it was very descriptive of, okay, do this, step A, step B.
Right.
10, go to 20. I was very okay with all of that.
You were into that. I found the book informative. I found that it was well laid out, well researched. No pictures, which I'm always kind of sad that there aren't any kind of goofy pictures in a book.
Pictures of meditation are boring.
Yeah, but you could do funny pictures
of people sitting and doing nothing.
No. What you would do is like before and after. You'd have people like throwing their coffee cups at other drivers. That would be the before meditation part. And then the after meditation part is that maybe they're just flicking them the bird.
It's a de-escalation.
Right. You're not. What I always say to people, especially, old people like me, is that, look, you're always going to have some kind of problems. You're probably going to have the same problems that you had when you were 20 years old and you're now 40-something years old. But the thing is that you can just learn to minimalize them, manage them, contain them, deal with them. They'll still pop up every once in a while. But
I was thinking about that because one of my friends is, having a bit of a rough patch. And we get to talking about like anger and stuff like that, and I noticed that like basically the big difference between the two of us is that he gets angry and acts on it, and I get angry and just kind of have that, oh look, my brain is angry, I'm just gonna let that go, kind of, I'm just gonna observe the anger and not do anything with it.
Well, that is a very meditative way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Me, I just get angry thinking about it. Actually, right now, we're just talking about anger, and I'm getting angry right now. I don't even know why. It just feels...
The problem with that is if you're angry and you have that just kind of, I'm going to observe the fact that I'm angry and I'm not going to necessarily act on it kind of mentality, can very easily, if you're not careful, make you very Machiavellian very quickly.
I can see that.
Because then you start planning and scheming.
Right.
What can I do to eliminate this anger from my life? Well, I can do this to this person, and then this will happen. And
one of the things, and I'm going to mention this to Rick as we're talking with him, is that he goes to great pains to in the book, is that his book, his methodology isn't just awareness training. It's also don't be a dick training too.
Yeah, well...
Because you can still be a dick and be mindful. Hell, that's a pure example of that right there, my friend.
You can very mindfully be a dick.
Right.
You can be a dick with purpose.
Right.
If you want. Most
Joseph
people don't
Stalin could have
recommend it.
been a Zen master, maybe, in terms of his awareness of how to inflict pain and misery on millions of people.
Yeah.
But that isn't what this isn't Rick's particular message. It is don't be a dick and be aware at the same time. That was my takeaway, at least.
Be aware of when you're being a dick and
manage
not
that
to do
shit.
That.
Manage that shit.
Yeah.
Rick Heller, how are you?
Hi. Good.
This is good. So, as you can probably tell, since we know each other, this is Andy. And the other guy there, say something, Jack.
Hi.
That's
Hey,
Jack,
Jack.
my co-host. And we know each other on Facebook, I think. All three of us. So
Yeah, so as I say, this is just sound, not video.
Right.
Yes,
Right.
this is correct. And no one wants to see me, Rick, to tell you the truth. Even I don't. When I pass myself in the mirror and I go, look at that guy. But I guess I'm not being very mindful of my appearance. Would you agree with that statement? If I look and pass myself in the mirror and I go and I'm shocked, that must mean I'm not being very mindful of how I look at that particular moment.
I would say it's the sort of self-compassion element in mindfulness. You're noticing yourself, but you're hating yourself.
Right. This is good. I like this. We're getting off to a good start. So for the people listening, explain what mindfulness is.
Well, so mindfulness is often defined as paying attention to what is going on in the present moment with an attitude that's non-judgmental. But I actually don't like the word non-judgmental so much because people often think that means neutral. But it's I and I think other people also see it as a positive attitude, a positive feeling, one that is friendly, is welcoming, is compassionate. So you're every moment of your life. Well, we shouldn't say every moment because I don't think you have to be mindful every moment. But basically, most of the time as you're practicing mindfulness, you are looking around in the world, in your interaction with the people and even interactions with inanimate objects. You have generally a warm, accepting feeling.
Mm-hmm. Because as you're writing in your book, Secular Meditation, that you break it down into two different aspects. You're talking about the loving compassion, the metta practice,
Right.
as well as the awareness. And it struck me that you wanted to make sure that people were aware, but not assholes.
Yeah, and I'll say metta is actually with two T's for listeners, METTA, as opposed to like meta, where you're talking about some level of indirection. It's this word from, I think it's the Sanskrit or either the Sanskrit or Pali languages. These were languages in ancient India. And it's translated as loving kindness, friendliness, benevolence. And so those are warm, friendly attitude. And it's perhaps the opposite. Is it? I don't know. Is it the opposite of cynicism? I don't know. But
so if you're going to do a quick meditation, if a person wanted to do a metta meditation, what would they be doing?
Well, we start off with a thought. Actually, we have some phrases. So the phrases I tweak them a little bit. That if you have a person in mind, and often I start off with either oneself or we call a benefactor, someone who's actually that it's easy to feel kind to. So I don't know, Andy, you probably don't start off with yourself, but but someone who's actually nice. And when you think about the person, it brings up warm feelings. And you say, I would like, silently, of course, I would like you to be safe. I would like you to be healthy. I would like you to be happy. I would like you to be at ease in the world. And when you say those things, it kind of makes you feel a little bit warm. And then what we do in this practice as it goes on is you leverage those feelings to direct toward people you're not as warm about, toward perhaps yourself. And then even we call the antagonist, people who irritate you. I often use the irritating coworker as the person to practice on.
Sure. And it sounds like, if nothing else, you're taking the edge off of the person that you really don't like or that you find that you have some difficulty with, and at least maybe shifting them into a neutral category.
Yeah, and I actually emphasize, and I don't know if I differ from people here, but I emphasize that what we're trying to do is make a shift, but not necessarily all the way toward absolutely loving, cherishing. So there's something what we call a neutral person. I say the example of a neutral person is you went into Dunkin' Donuts, you bought a cup of coffee. We actually say, like, remember who that person is if you're coming to the meditation tonight, because that's the person you can direct your kindness toward, and you actually can kind of shift that so that, like, the next time you go in for coffee, you'll have like a big smile when you order your coffee, and that's good. But then and actually with the irritating coworker, maybe we want to get them at least to a neutral state. You may not actually want to spend a lot of time with them any more than you may not want to spend any more time with them than you have to, but still, as long as you're spending time with them rather than being steamed about them, if you can get
Sure.
kind of a neutral state.
Sure. Are you trying to tell me that I have to give up my anxiety and anger? And if I do, does that mean I'm going to be funny anymore? Because a lot of the funny is based on those two things.
Well, that's an issue. So, I have at the very end, I adapt the serenity prayer into something I call the serenity statements. It's very easy. A lot of prayers, all you do instead of say, God grant me the serenity, you just say, I'd like to have the serenity. So instead of, you're not asking for a higher power, you are saying within myself, I can, try to cultivate these abilities. And in that serenity statement, you are deciding using wisdom, right? To decide whether this is something where you can reduce your suffering by practices such as acceptance. But sometimes you want the courage to confront, well, let's say it's social justice, the courage to confront some sort of evil in the world. But then also, I guess there's a case whether you want to be funny. So, you have to decide whether, it could be that, that you value this thing being funny. And if anger is a source of funny, you don't want to kind of give it all up. You might want to keep some of it. And I guess I would distinguish between anger and hatred, because I think...
Oh, yeah. I'm not big into hatred, I have to tell you.
Okay, good. Because I think momentary anger as a way to be passionate about something can be appropriate. Don't go overboard with it. But hatred is anger that is habitual and is no longer connected to a source. So if someone does something wrong to you, then it's fine to be anger. But if someone did something wrong 5 years ago, and then they say good morning, and you start with invective, that's hatred, right?
Right. That's ambient. That's just in part of your ecosystem, your psychological ecosystem, and no one wants that. That's like pollution. Yeah.
So that's definitely I even though hatred is something that evolved, but still I think there's no use case for hatred anymore. I don't think.
Right. There's been no peer-reviewed studies that show the usefulness of being in a continuous state of hate. I can understand that. And that's a great thing about this book too, because I don't want to give people the impression that you have not researched this book, because this book is full of footnotes and peer-reviewed studies.
I've got more than 100 footnotes. I went to journalism school a few years ago, one of my several degrees. And I've written some articles in Buddha Dharma magazine, Tikkun, and I was a correspondent for the Lowell Sun. I did nothing from the Lowell Sun made it into this book, but some of the more magazine articles that I did are in this book, plus additional things. So I've talked to scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists, and I've also talked to Buddhist teachers. So I have both the practical element and also some of the science behind it. And basically, my theory is that everything that's done in meditation happens through natural means, through changes that happen in the brain.
Sure. Yes, in fact, you state that several times in the book, which is important, that, hey, there's no supernatural aspect of this meditation that we're doing or that I'm proposing. You go at lengths to say that what you're doing is Buddhist-like, Buddhist-similar?
Buddhist-ish.
Buddhist-ish, that's the word. That's a great word. You're not taking a lot of the supernatural aspects that have kind of been hooked onto Buddhism.
So there's two things I'm not taking. So definitely, anything supernatural like rebirth, forget about it. But then even this thing about, there's something called not self. And, if you read Sam Harris's book, Waking Up, he's totally into this not self.
Yeah.
I'm still a little skeptical about it. I mean, I don't deny that you can get your brain in this state. There does seem to be some evidence that you can get your brain into this state that is referred to as not self, that your sense of self is attenuated.
Right.
I'm not convinced that there's really any proof that it's all that great. that makes you a better person.
Right. That's interesting.
Have you talked to any programmers? Because this is one of those things that, whenever I read this kind of stuff, it always seems like there is a certain amount of this is programming, like you're building neural pathways in a particular direction intentionally.
Well,
You
I
know?
am actually a sort of involuntarily not working software engineer, semi-involuntarily, but I have been. I was doing Ruby on Rails until about a year ago.
Right.
But I do think in that way. That is my mindset. So basically, when you cultivate a practice, it does a rewiring of the brain. But what it is kind of a little bit like a soft programming. When you do something once, there's a memory trace in the brain. When there's an area called the basal ganglia that's involved in habit formation. As you do things over and over again, this trace sort of becomes deeper and deeper. It's just like becomes a rut. If you're walking across the grass back and forth on a lawn somewhere, you develop a path there. It's the same thing in the brain, really, that the more you practice something, the more it becomes a path, a pathway, and it becomes easier to do it. The more you practice, and it's not just meditation, it's anything, baseball, tennis. The more you do it, the easier it comes.
Right.
And not only that, it becomes easy, not just while you're sitting down on a chair meditating, but even if you're out in the street and you see someone, and in a other situation you might scream your head off at them, but because they got you upset. But once you've done the loving kindness practice, you can kind of take a moment and kind of get yourself back to equanimity. Kind of is how we go about talking about it.
Cool. So in terms of the awareness portion of the meditation, I was reading through your book, of course, and I noticed that you were talking about breathing from the diaphragm. Now, Rick, have I been breathing wrong all my life? I have no idea how to breathe from my
A lot of
diaphragm.
people do, actually.
No, so how would I do that?
Well, the best way to get yourself to know this would be to lie on your back, like in bed or on a carpet or something like that. And also, I would say if you have any tight clothing, unbuckle your belt or something like that, and put your hand on your belly. And as you breathe, your belly should rise and fall if you're breathing not through your diaphragm. It's called diaphragmatic breathing. The diaphragm is actually a muscle that when you breathe in, it goes down and the belly expands to accommodate it. Your belly itself is not actually, the air is not actually going into the belly, but the belly is moving to accommodate the air that gets into your lungs.
Sure.
But a lot of times when you breathe, you're just breathing kind of through the upper registers of your lungs, and if your belly isn't moving, you're probably not taking the fullest, freest breaths. But although I do say, typically in our meditation, we don't really tell people to try to control their breathing. If you start to just relax and focus on the breath, it happens automatically.
Cool. I'm thinking about my belly right now as we're talking and as you were speaking. And so now I'm going to be thinking about my belly breathing.
I think in your case, your belly may expand, but the problem is it doesn't contract.
Is that you calling me fat? Well, that would be appropriate, I guess. Maybe, I don't know. I could lose, and that's the thing too. I was thinking about, because you wrote about how mindfulness can help about breaking, bad habits.
Mm-hmm.
And can you speak to that? Because I have like a laundry list of bad habits. One of them is my proclivity for Taco Bell AM Crunch Wraps.
Yeah. Well, as Jack sort of alluded to, there's sort of a brain. What goes on in the brain is a little bit like programming. One of my articles I wrote some time ago was about habits, and I interviewed there's a scientist at MIT, Anne Graybiel, has a whole lab that studies this, and they've studied it in mice, and they actually addict mice to chocolate, and they have this tea maze, and the mice learn the maze to try to get to the chocolate as quick as possible and things like that. And habits are actually, when you have a strong habit, is unconscious. It's automatic. Your brain is actually free to think consciously of other things, and your habit actually does its thing automatically, which is good because it allows you to multitask. And, we evolved this ability because habits it's kind of like parallel processing. You can do a lot of habits at the same time, but you can only think consciously once. But the thing is, if a habit is unconscious, what causes it to happen? And so there's a trigger. And the trigger is basically the environment. So and by that it could be the environment could include another person you're with. It may be that when there's this one particular person, you kind of act in a certain way. You know how sometimes people when they go see their family on the holidays, they act more childish,
Sure.
or or to say more less like an adult, because you have a habitual way of relating there, either with the people or actually even with the place, the home, that you act differently than you do maybe in here in Boston if you live in Boston. And so habits are triggered by your environment, and one way to kind of outsmart the habit is to change. So for instance, one thing is that you can't obviously do this all the time, but if you happen to move to do home or get a new job, that's actually a good time to try to quit one of your bad habits, because you might not let's say you smoke or whatever, right, and you're trying to quit smoking. You may have a particular way that this is where you hang out with people when you smoke at work. Your new job, you don't have that habit yet, so right when you start is the best way to try to act a little bit differently. And mindfulness is what happens by paying attention to your habits. You can kind of notice what the patterns are, and you can kind of figure out what the triggers are. So
Okay.
and then you can work it back.
Okay, so here's what happens to me. So I get out of work at 9 o'clock in the morning because I do these crazy sleep overnight shifts, and I go to the local Starbucks to do some writing, to make some cheap jokes. And on the way to the Starbucks, there's a Taco Bell.
I like Taco Bell.
I had this girlfriend, right? And she showed me, she was a very bad influence on me, let me say this. And she showed me the magic of what happens when you put a deep fried potato patty in with any kind of eggs. And, I'm driving past. Now, I don't hit the Taco Bell all the time. But it is a habit, and it's a bad habit. So this is what happens. I'm driving down the road, and I'm going, wow, I think I really deserve a Taco Bell AM Crunch Wrap right now, even though I stand to lose. All right, let's be kind. Let's show some loving kindness to me. Maybe I should lose 15 pounds. We'll lower all that up. And so I'm going back and forth. And, because I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking consciously about getting the AM Taco Bell Crunch Wrap. And on the days that I decide to go through the drive-thru, I hit my fuck it moment, and I said, I deserve a Taco Bell AM Crunch Wrap right now.
Sure.
So what should I be saying? What should I be doing in those moments so that I can avoid that bad behavior?
Well, number one is actually you might change your route. Seriously. You might drive a different way. If there's a particular place that is, your bad habit, if you can change your route, and it can make a big difference. Number two is sometimes just to observe your desire, to sort of see, instead of saying, I want something, actually sort of be mindful of the thought, which is to sort of notice what the thought is, kind of get distance from the thought, and don't identify with the thought, but see the thought as something that happened in your brain, and sort of take a scientific view of it. Notice when it happens, let it go, and then see what it pops up again. And by the time you've done all that, you'll be past Taco Bell.
That's a good point. I don't have to really outsmart myself that long to drive past the drive-thru. That's a very good point. I just have to hold it together for like maybe a couple of minutes.
Yeah, and that actually is an aspect of this not self thing, which there's some truth to it. That if a thought crosses your brain, you don't have to say that is necessarily. You don't have to identify with it. You can get a certain amount of distance from it. So I think that's a useful tool at cases where I'm a little bit skeptical of is people associated with enlightenment, and sort of in quotes, enlightenment. And I think that might be a bit much, but it is a useful tool to sometimes disidentify from your thoughts, sort of see it as kind of out there, not like in here.
Sure.
Well, so think of it like, have you ever had one of those things where, for whatever reason, some part of your arm or leg, you have a spasm, right?
Yeah.
Well, like, okay, that's not you causing that spasm. You're not consciously saying, I want my leg to freak out, right?
True.
But it's, so you're not, it's just something, but that kind of, I should get Taco Bell trip. If you think of that in the same way, it's kind of,
right.
It's just,
the interesting thing is our habits are not just food, the habits are thought. So basically, I like knee-jerk political opinions. Those are actually habitual. And Dr. Graybiel writes about how thoughts are habits. She doesn't talk about politics, but she thought thoughts are really, if you really get down to the science of it, thoughts are actually kind of habits of movement of the mouth, really. So when a certain pundit says something, they, often they're not necessarily using the exact same words, but there's a certain, your instantaneous reaction is habitual.
You know what I found interesting too is that the connection between thinking and very minute movements of the tongue and of the lips, that blew my mind because I hadn't heard about that since I was an undergraduate in psychology, where who was it? It was that Watson guy, the guy who discovered or who created pure behaviorism in America. He thought that thinking is just sublingual speech.
Exactly. Cool. Very, very good for remembering that. Watson didn't discover that. He got that from the guy I referenced in the book, Edmund Jacobson.
Awesome.
And Jacobson is this guy. He lived a long time. He died in the 1980s. His work goes back to like the 1920s at Bell Labs. He was working with people at Bell Labs, sure. And he, together with the people in Bell Labs, invented these. It's called EMG, which is way of measuring nerve conductance in the peripheral muscles. So, like arm, leg, or the tongue. And Jacobson discovered that when you actually just have internal thoughts, there's activation in the associated muscles of the lips, the tongue, the throat. I don't know if you ever read, I wrote a fantasy and science fiction magazine, published a story of mine about 15 years ago. It's called Loyal Puppies. I have it on my website. And I actually use that. It's called Loyal Puppies, and it's based on the idea of telepathy using implanted cell phone, essentially. So you'd have you'd have a chip, so essentially implanted in your larynx, and then another like kind of a cochlear implant, and you'd be able to just think thoughts and make cell phone calls with that. So Jacobson is the one who came up with those ideas, and then Watson took that on as you said, and as you learned in class.
Right, and there's a meditative practice that you explain in your book that if you maneuver your tongue in a certain way, you can actually shut down that mental voice that runs in all of our heads quite a bit.
Yeah. So in our first caution, the research I reference is about at least 30 years old, if not more. So I would like, if anybody's listening here who's a scientist, neuroscientist, I would like to see this research repeated using modern neuroimaging techniques. And I have not found anyone who's done that. But okay. I think it's legitimate. But the idea is that when you think, what happens in the brain leaks out into the muscles of speech. But there's also evidence that what you do with the muscles of speech influence your thoughts. This whole thing with like Botox, there has been research that when people get Botox, they can't frown anymore. It actually affects their emotions. It actually makes it a little bit more neutral or less angry. So perhaps you need that. Well, I guess that would ruin your career though. But but the idea is that. So one of the things I have is placing the tip of the tongue on the roof of the mouth. That's something I do sometimes. And roof of mouth, just behind the teeth, or the first ridge behind the teeth. And actually, I learned that from a fellow who was teaching, who came to our secular Buddhist group, and he shared a Qigong practice. That's where I got it from, and I found that's how I experienced it working. And then I kind of connected it with his other research. And I think the basic theme is that anything that interferes with speaking out loud will also interfere with speaking your inner voice. So if I were to do this now and I just say, and that was hello, Andy, with the tip of my tongue on the roof of my mouth, you're incoherent. Right. So doing that makes your inner speech incoherent as well, and it kind of quiets it. Yeah. You can't talk to yourself anymore.
No. In the intro, me and Andy were talking some etymology stuff, and you saying that immediately made me think of the phrase "bite your tongue."
Yeah, people. I think some aspects of sort of folk wisdom might touch on that a little bit. Yeah.
And there's also a meditative practice to silence or to help dampen the visual thinking going on in your brain too, by softening and relaxing the muscles around the eyes.
Yeah, I'm actually not quite so good at that. But one of the people I interviewed, Dr. Paul Lehrer, he's at Rutgers. He's a scientist over there, and he's kind of connected that research. He said it's not just so your inner speech is associated with the muscles of speech, and your internal imagery is actually associated with eye movements. And what he suggested is, for instance, if you were to don't do this if you're driving. I don't know if anybody's listening while driving, but if you were to close your eyes and you were to visualize the Eiffel Tower and kind of imagine looking at Eiffel Tower from bottom all the way to the tippy top, you would almost certainly be moving your eyes inside the closed lids. So your eyes are also react in this way, even when you're doing just your inner vision. The muscles of your eyes react. And if you can kind of relax the muscles of your eyes, people don't necessarily know how to do that. The way I suggest people do that is try the opposite. Try staring at something. And you notice if you stare at something, after a while your muscles get tired because it's kind of tense. And then let them go. Letting them go is what I mean by softening your gaze.
Sure. I found it interesting that part of your own personal journey, learning how to meditate, involved some kind of eye strain with you. That you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I, from the time I was like 19 to about 26, I was starting to have pretty serious eye strain. When I moved out to California in 1985 is when this occurred. It tended to be quite bad. I've been going to doctors, and I went to one eye doctor who said, "Oh, it's probably psychosomatic." I didn't believe him. I was kind of upset. He was actually right, but he didn't have the bedside manner. He didn't do it. So then I went to the specialist at University of California, San Francisco Medical School. He gave me a thorough examination. He said to me that my eyes were fine, but that I had become hypersensitive to pain by focusing on it, and that as he understood it, that if you focus on pain too much, it actually amplifies pain. And for some reason, there's it's kind of a long story, but I believed him, and I took it to heart. And really, over the next 48 hours, I decided to just accept the pain, and it went away. It was really a miracle. And I'd been having this pain for about 8 years, and then, and since then, it's mostly gone. I mean, I have eye strain once in a while, but it's not become a syndrome or anything like that, like it was. And this is very much consistent with this Buddhist message. It's something called the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism, and they have a capital T in Buddhism, but I use them as a lowercase t. Although I think if you actually look in the book, it might be capitalized. But in my mind, it's a lowercase t.
We'll just blame your copy editor for that.
Right. In my mind, it's lowercase t. But basically, a lot of Buddhism is actually good psychology. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. And one of the essential points is that if you encounter something negative and you feel negative toward it, it actually compounds the negativity. It's not like math where you negating a negative becomes a positive. In the brain, and there's research that shows this too, aside from Buddhism, I think scientific research having to do with, there's this area called the anterior cingulate cortex is one of the areas that controls it's called part of the salience network. It says is what I'm doing consistent with my goal, and if not, it creates a signal which is essentially what we call suffering. And if you're trying to if you have pain and you say no, I don't want this pain, and you're saying negative, you're being negative toward the pain, it ends up amplifying this whole thing. It becomes this vicious cycle. Whereas if you accept the pain, then you're actually telling this area that, what's going on is actually not so bad. It's not inconsistent with my goals. You can kind of quiet down. So it's a paradoxical logic in the brain that acceptance brings us to neutrality, whereas rejection kind of produces a vicious circle.
That's interesting. I have tinnitus, this ringing in my ears, and the more and I've had it since I was a kid. I remember distinctly 7-6 years old having this. Because I'm talking about it right now. To tell you the truth, it's getting louder. Because I'm paying attention to it. Whenever I start paying attention to it, or whenever I become aware of it, or maybe hyper aware of it, in this case, it becomes much more prominent. And so my strategy has been just accepting it, and this is just what goes on. This is normal, and it doesn't really impair me, because I'm not going to pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's been very useful. It's interesting. I was listening to NPR, and and I forget which program it was. There was a person, and it was about thinking and about thoughts and how psychology has had different schools of thought about how you should interact with what goes on in your brain. And this particular person was really upset about all the violent thoughts he had, and he was really, really upset about them. And then he went to different psychologists until he finally came up to a therapist that said, listen, everyone has crazy thoughts in their head. You just can't give them more power over you than what they deserve.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say I'm an expert on that, but I would say that, again, I think disidentifying that, for instance, if you watch a violent movie, you are going to, some of those images that you saw on the screen, a slasher movie or something, those images are going to repeat. It's kind of like, you ate a hot dog and it repeats on you. You see a movie, it can repeat on you. But if you think, oh my God, I'm thinking the same thoughts, I must be a serial killer. No, you just saw a movie and those images are coming back.
Exactly.
So disidentify from them.
Right. In the book, you talked about the relationship between Greek philosophy, or some potential connection between Greek philosophy and Buddhism. And I hadn't heard about this before. You want to talk about that?
Sure. So I don't know if you were at the event we had at the Humanist Hub where Stephen Batchelor did a signing of his book, but actually in his previous book, which he also came to the Humanist Hub at Harvard, was it A Reflection of a Buddhist Atheist, or something like that? Title something
Sure.
like that. Confession of a Buddhist Atheist, I think. But he writes about this, that there's reason to believe that there was contact between Greece and India in ancient times via Persia. So we all know that Alexander the Great conquered, at least part of India. That's the Indus Valley. Right. But even before that, the Persian Empire had conquered parts of Greece and also parts of India, and they were moving people around. So there were actually some Greek colonies in India. I think maybe even before Alexander, but certainly by the time of Alexander and afterwards. So there was connection between Greece and India. So, and there's very specific idea that Greek philosophers, it's actually recorded in ancient texts, that Greek philosophers accompanied Alexander, encountered Indian philosophers, and brought back some of their wisdom. And so, and some of it is very similar to some aspects of Buddhism. There is this aspect of being focused on the present moment. And so Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and philosopher, if you read his meditations, he talks about being focused on the present moment with a sense of detachment. There's some things were perhaps lost in translation, but I think there's an actual line that can be drawn between the two.
Interesting. Yeah. I hadn't thought about it before, and I found that connection interesting because I didn't know, when was the Buddha supposedly alive? Do we have a good...
Yeah, so he is thought to have lived around the time of Socrates, or maybe a generation or two before. Sure. And I think no one really disputes that he was a person. There was no writing at the time there. It was an oral tradition, and things were written down probably about 500 years ago. But I think people consider him to be a historic character, and I consider him to be essentially like a philosopher. And if you look at people we think of as philosophers like Plato believed in rebirth too.
Yeah.
So
true.
we don't think of Plato as a religious figure, but the thing is, Buddha, just because of certain historical evolution in Asia, some people did start to believe in Buddha and the historical Buddha, plus there's other people they called Buddhas, as people one could have supernatural contact with. I don't really think that's his fault, though, as far as I know.
Right. That's interesting because Alexander the Great was after Socrates, from what I understand of my ancient history.
It was Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander of Aristotle.
Right. So that definitely makes sense. That if nothing else, there would be connection.
If nothing else I said makes sense, that does.
Okay, very good. What I found interesting is that when you label negative emotions, you actually lessen the negative emotions, but that's the same thing for happy emotions too.
Yeah, there is one of the meditations is called mindfulness of emotions, and actually that's a one I learned by attending a workshop. With that, you do a regular, let's say, breath meditation. But every 30 seconds or so, you say what feeling you have. You kind of poll your body, what feeling you have. And there's some evidence by some scientists. I think it was out in UCLA that they call it affect labeling. Affect is a word for emotion. And if you label your emotion, it kind of brings it back a little bit toward neutrality. And it's not necessarily instantaneous, but just sort of, I think they talked about in the context also of journaling, and you sort of write about your feelings, you kind of get it out. But simply a meditation, which you kind of notice your feelings, it helps by becoming conscious of your feelings. It's almost as if the body is trying to deliver a message, and by becoming conscious of it, the body can kind of relax. I don't know if that's exactly what's going on, but I would say it's almost as if that was the case.
It sounds almost like I mean, once you bring something into the language centers, you're bringing it into a more rational part of your brain, because emotions are prelingual versus.
Right.
Like, so once you start thinking about something in language, you're thinking about it with a more rational part of your mind just from the go. So the emotive effects get, lizard brain stuff kind of gets pushed to the back.
Lizard brain.
Yeah, and in terms of, it's probably also true that if you become conscious of your happy thoughts, that it might mute it. So I'm okay with sort of being strategic about it, like practicing this when you're down, but like if you're happy, like stay happy.
Yeah, just let it go, right?
That's a T-shirt. If you're happy, stay happy. So there's an aspect, and I don't know if you've had this question asked of you before. When I was reading through the book, I definitely glommed onto a lot of interesting points, but there is a social justice kind of, and you addressed this, don't get me wrong, but I was thinking, if you're trying to be less miserable in the world, if there is real data that says, hey, man, you should be miserable, or that you are living in miserable conditions, does this kind of loving acceptance of those miserable conditions act as like a opium for the masses, or could it act in that way?
Well, I want to first sort of say what are miserable conditions. So my claim is that actually people can be you need your basic physical needs met. So you need food. You need water, hydration. You need shelter, a place to sleep. You need some basic health care. And I think once you have that, you actually can be happy, because the sort of meditations that I suggest with the loving kindness, and you can actually shift your emotions, it does actually draw upon the physical resources of the brain, including glucose. And if you're malnourished or if you haven't slept, you're not going to be able to do it very well.
Sure.
So you do need those basic physical needs. But a lot of the things that people want are, if you can't go to Disney World, you might be unhappy, but you actually can be happy. And one of the things through my meditation practice is, I do take vacations from time to time, but I'm actually I'm more happy hanging around locally than I was. So as I say, like when I have something about being mindfulness while hiking. I used to be that I thought hiking was boring until you get to the top of the mountain, but now I feel that the actual walk, even at the bottom, I can kind of really key into where I am, the space, the vegetation, and I get a real sense of wonder even from that. So one of my themes is that you can be happier a lot cheaper.
Sure.
Just locally. But there are some bad things in where there's in the middle in Syria there's like war, people are dying. So that's not something that mindfulness is not going to help with that. Well, if the people who are killing people were more mindful, it would help. But just a victim being mindful is not going to help. Mindfulness doesn't help your basic physical secure in general. Mindfulness works on the psychological level, but you need to have some basic physical health and security. So I don't say that just accept everything. So if there's a war going on, people need to do things to try to restore peace and safety, and therefore it might be appropriate to do certain things that make you a little bit anxious and agitated and fearful, to try to restore restore peace and safety.
Sure.
Although some people may say, and so actually, I interviewed a few other people I know in the mindfulness group and at the Hub, and Christopher he's someone who's on the staff of the Hub, and what he says is that he does social justice work, and he says that his mindfulness practice helps him do the social justice work without burning out, because you can deal with stuff that's upsetting by being mindful and kind of getting back to equanimity. He can kind of do it rather than like freak out.
Right.
Well,
because
I think.
Go ahead, Jack. I'm sorry.
I think that's one of those things that, because general Eastern philosophy meditation stuff, not ridiculously widely accepted in the United States, and I think in some ways the kind of consumer capitalist culture that we are steeped in, there's this idea in people's heads that if they find inner peace, they're going to be complacent and therefore they're not going to advance. I think people look at contentment as a detriment. It's kind of a sitting on your laurels kind of thing,
Well, I kind of get into that a little bit. So I actually ask. I have some practices. I have the 32 practices, but I also have frequently asked questions. So one of them is mindfulness the secret to happiness? And my answer is it's half the secret. And so I refer to a study by Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton. These are both people who won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics, actually separate years, interestingly enough. Deaton just won it this year. And they have this study about does more money make you happy? And they found that up to $75,000 was a key point. And they found that there were two aspects of happiness. One is their moment-to-moment emotions, and that up to $75,000, money made a difference, because if you're really poor, you can be really stressed. But above $75,000, this was written about 3 or 4 years ago, so pretty current. People who earn more than $75,000, that however much they made, that they really didn't affect their moment-to-moment emotions. That was actually enough. So other things were affecting them. But this other aspect that they said that was affected by money, whether people was what they call life evaluation. And this is really more like self-esteem, where if you make $500,000, you think well of yourself. So it's more of a cognitive or thinking versus feeling. I connect mindfulness to the moment-to-moment feelings. And my claim is that mindfulness can get you that first part, to a moment-to-moment feeling well. Whether it really helps you with that second part, life evaluation, I'm not entirely sure that it does. I mean, I would question whether you need to choose values that says that if I make $500,000, it's better. It's so much better than I made $75,000, just because it makes me a more important person. I can think better of myself. But that's a kind of a deeper issue that I don't know that I have a lot of evidence on. But I think on the first aspect, this moment-to-moment feeling, mindfulness gets you that.
Yeah, interesting.
And in some respects, that reducing that worry, even if you're below that $75,000 mark, right? Not worrying about the fact that you're below that mark actually makes it easier for you to be more effective and maybe get to that mark.
Yeah, it certainly could. But, if people are working minimum wage, there's no question that there's some stresses there. It might affect their health and things like that. So
Sure.
Yeah.
But anything that reduces that stress makes them better and happier.
Yeah, I would agree. And, and some people do find that they can live on, a fairly low income, be happy. But, I do say, and even myself, I kind of want to, I don't know if I keep up with the Joneses. I want to at least keep the Joneses in sight. When the Joneses are like so far away that I can't see them, that can be a little bit sad.
No, I didn't mean to turn this into an economics discussion, but
well, that's exactly what the question was. I mean, we were definitely going into that territory.
Well, yeah, but what I was more going for there was I think there is this general apprehension about this idea of inner peace. Like, I think there's a lot of people who look at contentment as a detriment. Like they don't want to be content.
Well, you know what I like
weird to me, but it's I think that there are people who are like that.
You know what I like about this book and your take on this particular meditation of mixture of meta as well as awareness training is that I get the impression, and this might be a stereotype, is that a lot of people who just do awareness training just seem to be really self-involved wankers sometimes. They have their yoga mats, and this is no offense to anyone who does yoga, but you definitely get a sense of very pleased with themselves kind of
Navel gazers.
vibe. Yeah, navel gazing, and gazing, and if you could see me, I'd be sneering. I think I'm in a sneer as I say that. Yeah, yeah.
I wouldn't want to make that as a generalization, but I
Oh
recognize.
no. This is all
But
me.
I always recognize that as a generalization that's out there. And what I have done in my books, I lead off with the loving kindness or the metta. One of the reasons is, I'm mostly targeting this to non-Buddhists, including people who are completely non-religious. But also, I'm actually interested in getting people who have a religion other than Buddhism.
Yeah,
That's the Jews, Christians, Muslims, who whatever, be interested in this because it's definitely doesn't have anything that's Buddhist religion.
yeah.
It's a tool, just like push-ups. So
Sure.
it's an exercise.
Yeah.
That's my little marketing sort of thing or whatever. But I do start with loving kindness, particularly because I kind of feel with the secular humanist community that I'm with, there's a big interest in social justice, and I think loving kindness kind of connects with that. Loving kindness meditation is something that is a little bit more, you might say, extroverted than just paying attention to your breath.
Sure.
You actually are, when you're actually doing it, your eyes are closed and you're in your own head, but you're actually thinking about other people, and it actually affects the way you interact with other people after the meditation. So that's one of the reasons why I've. Oh, and by the way, I've actually the Secular Student Alliance has a meditation activity package. So if there are any students out there, I've got the loving kindness meditation is now an activity packet that students can do. All the instructions are there as part of their activities at their school.
We should definitely, if there's a link to that people can get hooked up.
Yeah, I'll give you the link. Sure.
That would be definitely great to share with people. So compassionate speech, you mentioned it in the book.
And that would totally ruin your podcast.
Right. Well, I'm not going to engage in it, but I'm not going to stop you from talking about it, Rick.
So that's that's one of the principles of Buddhism, and that's actually one where I'm maybe I don't understand it properly or whatever, but I kind of think other people may not either. I think there is a tendency in some Buddhist communities to use kid gloves, and as a result, there have been some scandals in Buddhism with gurus.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think that there's any. I don't think it's any worse than any other religion or whatever. But I do think that there does tend to be a problem of perhaps people always being a little bit too nice.
Yeah.
And one of the principles is sort of that it's really not saying bad things about people, even if the bad things are true.
Sure.
Or you have to really couch them. Yeah. So, and I think, as a journalist, boy, that would definitely put me out of business. I think Donald Trump, period, end of story.
Right.
So I do think, but on the other hand, there's something else. It's called nonviolent communication by the late Marshall Rosenberg. He doesn't refer to Buddhism, but it's very similar, and he has a technique for engaging in people in a way that it's called nonviolent. Obviously, by saying not engaging in rhetorical violence, by engaging people in difficult conversations, but trying essentially to be mindful of their emotions and their reactions, and speaking in a way that can connect with them. And I think it does work in cases where people have agreed to mediation. But even with that, I don't see in the larger world of political debate, it doesn't seem to. I'm not convinced that it works, because if anyone out there is doing it, they're not getting much prominence because our speech is getting worse and worse. I don't really.
That's a whole function of our political speech becoming more and more like watching sports.
Right.
It has nothing to do with the actual content of the ideas. It's because political speech has become this, big. Tonight, Saturday night's the big fight,
and rhetorical violence pushes emotional buttons and gets our attention. This is all about how the brain works, and I do think that certainly compassionate speech is. I present it as certainly something within your own family. It's great with it. It's terrific, and people. and it definitely works there, but I'm not entirely sure how effective it can be in the larger environment.
Sure.
Well,
No,
just because it doesn't catch eyeballs. But
Exactly.
but what you're saying is definitely true. I mean, as far as certain Buddhist traditions, kids' gloves and all that, there's definitely this kind of disconnect where at some point certain groups will always tend towards taking kindness the wrong way, and there's something to be said for politely pointing out something that someone is doing wrong to them so they notice it. You
Well,
know,
okay, so
like
I'm not a parent, and perhaps parents, any parents out there, I know Andy is one can talk about this. But yeah, if you were to just only to be, if you were your children sometimes need some feedback that is not always entirely you go yay yay.
right. This is true.
don't be that parent. But I think once everybody's an adult, we on some level we still need to do that to each other. Is basically.
I think it was. I'm going back once again to my undergraduate days. I think the humanist philosopher Carl Rogers. Is it Carl Rogers? I don't know. He developed this.
Yeah, he's a psychologist. Yeah,
a psychologist. All right.
humanist.
Yeah, and he developed this kind of Rogerian. I think that's the term, Rogerian way of telling the truth, in which you're being compassionate but not being a dick.
Mm-hmm. Well, just briefly, what the nonviolent communication thing is, it sort of says first, connect with the person as a human being before you even try anything in terms of difficult conversation. So if you can find out, if you some things that you like, you both like music, you both like sports, try to just connect with them as a person first. Number one. Number two is start out with statements. Try to get the sort of statements that are factual. So, for instance, what I sort of said is, people say, "What you did was outrageous," and if someone says that, I'm like, "Oh my God, I'm in trouble. I have an emotional reaction." Where if you were to just simply say, "I am really steamed by what you did," that might get me an emotional reaction, but I'd actually sort of agree with that. I'd see you're steamed, like, oh yeah, I can say you are steamed. That is a factual statement, and that doesn't. I don't have to. Part of it is to sort of get people to say yes instead of no. So if you say what you did is outrageous, I say no. I'd say no. If I say I'm outraged by what you did, I say yeah, I guess so.
I find that kind of thing especially useful if it's someone who I know very well. Like that's the kind of thing that really works well with family and friends and whatnot. Because if it's someone who's your friend and you know them very well, you can say, I don't think that particular thing you just did was entirely in line with your goals.
Oh yeah.
Because and then you, at that point it's
but I think part of the problem actually in our political speech. Sorry, but part of the problem with political speech in journalism, actually, what works against it perhaps is the sort of notion of objectivity that in articles you try to keep the word "I" out of it, because if you use the word "I," you're admitting it's subjective. Whereas if you don't use the word "I," it sounds like a fact.
Sure.
So people tend to do that, and it's funny. When I was in journalism school, when you learn, when you write a story, you really. And a magazine article could be a little bit different, but certainly in newspaper journalism, you really try to avoid using the word "I," and so, to the point where if very rarely, but once in a while, I'll see a story where it'll say so and so, even so and so attacked a reporter, or physically, or something like that. When the person might actually refer to themselves in the third person as a reporter, but you don't want to say so and so me. You know, so and so tripped me, or whatever. So and so tripped a reporter. That's how people write it.
Right.
Yeah, that was never the most useful. The most useful trick I ever learned for the writing thing was the whole try and eliminate as many be verbs as possible. That was the one that always really did it for me when I was going through and editing stuff. That was fun.
So, Rick, what else are you working on these days? Working on any other new projects?
Yeah, well, I am working on a mystery novel. Actually, I've finished it. I'm looking for an agent, and that's another process. The book Secular Meditation, it's published by New World Library, and I was able to connect to an editor through Rick Hansen, who is the author of Buddha's Brain, I definitely recommend Rick Hansen's writings. He's someone who's both. I think he's basically a therapist in terms of his day-to-day job, but he has a PhD, a science PhD. And I took a couple of workshops with him, which is at Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. So that's how I connected with him. So I did not have an agent for that, but the mystery novel, I'm looking an agent for that, and after that, I'm trying to figure out. Now I'm actually trying to figure out what to do next. It's an open question, actually.
And of course, you're still leading the humanist meditation group on Tuesday.
Yes, every Tuesday night at 7 p.m., except between Christmas and New Year's. Every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at the Humanist Hub in Harvard Square. I have a meditation, and it's called. We are the Cambridge Secular Buddhists on Meetup.com. If anyone wants to find out what we're going to do.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to turn into a pumpkin because my life, it's like a game of Tetris. That's what it is. One piece just fits into another piece. There's not a lot of give in between the pieces. And I'm going to turn into a pumpkin. Thanks for coming on. I think this was a very informative episode on the Naked Eye podcast.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, I think this is definitely one of our more brainy episodes so far.
So, Jack, it's great to talk with you too, Jack.
Yeah, it was really nice to meet you, man.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Okay, well, take care.
Okay.
Have a good day.